Great, wonderful. So thank you so much for doing this interview. I'm really excited to learn more about your practice and your perspectives on your work. Um, and I'll start out with asking you how your time was at art school. Um,
Oh yeah. So I went to Central St Martin's. I did a BA. I never did a MA. It was I started out as a painter, and they moved me quite quickly into something called critical fine art practice. I think because I wanted to talk about work, so they sort of told me the painting wasn't the place for me, which was probably true. And I don't know, I was young, it was London. I was from like a small town in the north or in the
yeah,
Midlands, so it was like it felt a bit overwhelming, but also I had tons of energy and I would cycle everywhere. And yeah.
that's great. That's really cool. And
Hmm.
did you find that the course that they moved you into, was it more rewarding? Did it kind of feed into your work in a better way? How did you find that?
Yeah, I mean, it was Anne Talentire, who's a great artist who runs that course with Monica Ross, who sadly passed away. Um,
Mm.
it was very theoretical and philosophical, and yeah, it was very stimulating. Uh, it was sort of, it was definitely the right place for me. I think I really appreciated like who was brought through, and especially Anne and her whole political and yeah, she's just a very decent person and a very good artist. So that makes a big difference.
That's great.
Mm.
Yeah. And how did you kind of sustain your practice after you left art school? How did you find that transition?
Um, I worked in hostels for homeless people for a long time in London. I was doing
Wow.
night shifts. That was intense and quite a big contrast, I would say, to simultaneously. I got a free studio from Akava for a year that was right
Great.
in Soho, right across from where St Martin's used to be on Charing Cross Road. And so actually, like that whole time of mm, sort of working in these rolling shelters, that's what they were called at the time. They were for long-term rough sleepers, and then sort of going
Mm.
to openings and being involved in like the local art scene and having friends who are artists and doing that thing of like doing shows with your friends and sort of doing small shows. That whole experience in a way kind of led into this film that I made, Gamekeepers Without Game, which was also a lot about this sort of contrast that you get in London, that's quite extreme between extreme poverty right next to gentrification that we know. And then we know how like artists kind of get called the vanguards of gentrification, although I think often we sort of overestimate the role that we play in that,
Yeah.
because we very seldom get to actually benefit from any of that stuff. But yeah, that's how I survived for a long time. And then I got a teaching job when I was 28,
Okay.
which was a lifesaver. Because then I could work in the day, and then because I could work in the day, and because also I was doing stuff that was more close to what I cared about and what I was making work about, and it wasn't also like working in the hostels made everything else seem a little bit meaningless because it was so extreme.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And also it made like friendships and relationships really difficult because you were like working at night and sleeping in the day. So it was nice to get this teaching job, and then also to be like simultaneously I was young to start teaching, which was good and bad. It was good because you sort of feel like you have so much to prove, and it also gets that muscle in your brain working. So I would write courses, and that was always really exhilarating to have that opportunity to kind of write stuff and research stuff and then make it live. But at the same time, if you start teaching when you're young, you get a lot of, especially as a woman, I think you get a lot of aggression. So that was like a big, yeah, that was difficult. But Anne helped me a lot, actually, because I was teaching back in the place where I was a student, and she,
Ah, okay.
so like what happens a lot when you're teaching lecturing, I don't know if this happens so much to men, but it happens a lot to women, is you will get sort of asked like, why are we reading this, or we're only reading this because it's fashionable, or you get attacked a lot. And she would just give me really simple advice like ask if that's how everybody feels, because normally it's just one person that wants to destroy you. and everybody else is like
Yeah.
wants to learn. So like
As a
once you,
vendetta.
yeah, exactly. But once you have that, once you have these really simple tools, it's much easier not to feel so vulnerable, I think.
So she kind of gave you methods to subvert that attack while you were
Yeah,
working.
yeah, or even stuff like a lot of the like teaching is also can be very emotional for people. So for the, you know, it's as it still is, like as you get older as an artist, it's very emotional to kind of share your work with other people, especially if it's like a one-on-one studio visit. So, you know, people will cry a lot, or they will break down, or like, you know, you get the whole gamut of emotions running through that
Yeah.
that particular encounter, and learning to deal with that, I think, is mm, part of the job a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, how did that affect your work then? The kind of interaction with students and that whole, yeah.
um I think massively, it affected my work massively. I think and so I'm taking a break from teaching now, because I think teaching is like has been extraordinary, but I also think at some point it can make you a little bit schizophrenic, because to be good at teaching, you have to, and like, what's the point in doing it if you don't want to be good at it? You sort of like, you go into a space with someone, and you try to listen to them, and then from that listening you try to put yourself in their place and be helpful to
Mm.
them, like be useful to them. And that happens,
Yeah.
like, say you're doing individual tutorials all day, so you do that like for an hour with one person, and their work is completely distinct from the next person you do it for an hour, and then the completely distinct, but like completely distinct. So in order to do that, you're like constantly moving your brain into different spaces, and I think after a while, yeah, you just have to take a break from that. Otherwise, you know, it does something very good to you, but it also, after a while, you have to stop, because you feel like you're losing yourself a bit. But then in contrast to that, I also always tried to write a lot of courses, and those courses would be simultaneously a reflection on what I was working on, and a way of kind of expanding that into, or reflecting what the student year was like that year. So you know, trying to sort of socialize, so that they got to talk to each other about things that they like, kind of common sympathies, I suppose. So I did one, like
Yeah.
the last one I did in Malmö, for instance, was called "This is the Land with No Path," and it was a lot looking at kind of filmmaking, experimental filmmaking, as a sort of social, improvisatory space that also uses technology and the body, and how you can do things like, so for instance, we'd be looking into the work of Loretta Farrenholtz or Erica Beckman, but we'd also be reading texts and trying to read those texts as though they were, let's say, for instance, like a script or a rehearsal for something. This thing that Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about, that you read texts as though they're a rehearsal for life. So it's kind of, it's sometimes as though like the filmmaking, with that course, it was as though the filmmaking practice was very much like there to be used by us,
Mm.
outside of the realm of industrial cinema, but rather within this kind of, and not necessarily as a pedagogical tool in terms of that's its end point either, but that it's a kind of like a way of thinking about praxis.
Mm. That's really interesting. So it's generative. It kind of opens up pathways into research and also forms a community. It's like a, yeah, really interesting.
And also,
Uh,
yeah, exactly. And also this, the improvisation is this thing that, you know, if you're making films with not much money, you get really good at thinking on your feet. And that's something you can also apply to the way you read, I think, or the way you gather research material.
mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, and so I wanted to ask kind of also about your practice. So how does your research for your projects tend to begin? Is there a kind of common method that you use when you bring in a project?
um, I think with Night for Day, which is the last project, um, it started off very different from how it ended. So it started with me thinking about A Long Day's Journey into Night, the play, and reversing it so that it got lighter instead of darker. and thinking about the mother experimenting with LSD instead of being addicted to morphine. And then I sort of wrote like a script for that and spent a lot of time on that, and then decided that it was too much and I couldn't get the funding. But that also maybe it was a little bit self-indulgent. So then I took it back to just a mother-son relationship. And then I decided that I wanted to base it on real life characters. And then I met Isabel de Carmo, and I met these two young men that were starting a startup to look at machines and how they recognize moving images. And I was researching Mulheres de Clandestinidad, about like women who were living undercover during the dictatorship as part of this big concerted effort to try and resist. And I was reading Mulheres de Animas by Isabel Linding, and that was like part of and Siglia, this like old magazine, and I was going to the Geographic Library and reading Siglia. But I was also sort of, you know, how does the research? I was also kind of trying to find the location for the house, which was this family house that had been built in the 70s, but that hadn't changed, which was quite difficult in Portugal because like houses like that, luxurious houses or houses that are architecturally significant. I mean, he firstly is not one of the big celebrated Portuguese architects, so that house is not, it's been protected by his wife, but it hasn't been protected yet, although I think it's on the cards. It hasn't been protected yet by the state. So it's been protected by her. I think she didn't tell me this directly, but what I think has happened is she probably sold it to a private owner on the proviso for not much money, for less than it's worth, I imagine, on the proviso that can't be changed, because it's sort of she loves that house. You know, it's the house where they brought their kids. It's the house where they built it themselves. Wow. So once I'd found that space, which was, I found by talking about research, I went to like Serralva's bookshelf and I found this book on Portuguese architecture since the 70s. And, you know, looking for this house, and I just saw this black and white photograph of that house, Antonio Teixeira Guerra's house, with a dog sort of running around outside. And then I showed it. It was very lucky. I showed it to a friend of mine who's an architect at lunch. And he said that the woman that he was working for used to work for Teixeira Guerra, and that she had contact with his son. So then through Facebook, I contacted the son, and then the son put me in touch with the mother. And then I had this phone conversation with the mother, who's 81, who was living in like rented accommodation in Rato. And so we were doing, anyway, that's how it all came about. It was all this, it was like a lot of sorts of, I was very lucky.
Yeah. But it's interesting, it also echoes the mother and son within the film itself. It's kind of like these intergenerational, or yeah, it's really interesting. And so I was also going to ask, how collective or individual is your practice generally when you make films?
Yeah, I don't know about this, because I don't know about claims of collectivity. I remember like very young, when I was a student, there was one of my peers was making collective work, and it was already then very contentious thing to say. And that what they decided was that you can't really say something's collective unless you all equally own it. Like you can all go around and give lectures on it as though it's your work, or like you can all do interviews about it as though it's your work. So I always feel a little bit reluctant to say that it's collective in that way, although of course it's always collective. But I raise the money and then I pay people, and then normally I don't pay myself, but then I recoup something through like the stuff after. So I don't know, like if I would really say it's collective. I don't know if I can really claim that.
Yeah. No, I completely understand. And I also think with artist film, it's always ambiguous. You know, it's kind of, you talk with people, it opens up doorways and kind of shapeshifts. So it's not one thing or the other thing, but kind of traverses.
Yeah, I mean, if I think about someone like Derek Jarman, for instance, you know, his producer, James Mackey, must have produced a lot of his films, and then Jarman left him the Super 8s. So as a thank you, I guess, and then Mackie sold them to Tate. That was like, I guess, a way of Jarman saying thank you. I think often with artist film, because it's like so precarious, there are often these ways of getting around or like saying thank you to people in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was interested in how ambiguity forms the work that you make.
Yeah, I saw this question. I didn't quite know how to answer it. Ambiguity. Yeah, can you maybe tell me what you mean? What do you mean?
I suppose specifically in Night for Day, I was struck by the spaces that were opened up and kind of left open between scenes, between concepts. And I was interested in what that, I guess, openness or ambiguity in that sense meant to you in your work, how you create those spaces and how, yeah, what that means for you.
Yeah, I always appreciated a lot work that was quite like a sort of drop of color hitting like absorbent paper and then just like spreading out. I always liked stuff that was gave you bits and then let it expand in your mind, much more than what happens in a lot of the stuff that we watch on TV, like even the good stuff, is that you get set sort of riddles, and then the riddles, like you get to answer the riddle, or the riddle gets answered for you, and it makes you feel a little bit clever, or you're constantly sort of on a cliffhanger, or which seems much more about passing time before you die, rather than what's often wonderful about poetry or music or art or culture that's more ambiguous, to use your word, like ambiguous, is that it allows you to think into it or feel into it or become a part of it, and that's just always been very powerful to me, so I try and put it into my own work.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's like a gesture, because I was curious about the relationship, because you studied painting, or you were a painter originally.
I mean, I wanted to be.
Okay. Yeah. But would you say that that's still kind of an important aspect of you as a filmmaker, this kind of painterly, or how would you feel about that?
I often try to, I mean, if you're asking me about research too, I often try to keep in mind artworks that I have loved and what it was about them as as a influence, and that can be painting, that can be like Rembrandt's The Abduction of Proserpina, which I think about a lot, or this sort of swelling of something that feels like, so he makes nature feel like treasure, like this treasure that comes for free, or this stuff that I don't know, Susana de Sousa Dios, I think about like how hard her films are, but like how also they're very dark, and then you can expand into them more. I often try and keep these things in my head, so that it also doesn't become I don't really like it when artists that kind of justify their work in terms of like a research that's like I don't know, more kind of an academic research, because I think often it's like we get bought in. I've seen it happen a lot with the kind of like conferences or academic conferences where artists get bought in as a kind of afterthought to illustrate, or it's because because we're in an art school, but actually everybody wishes they're in a philosophy school or whatever. And you see this thing happening, and it really I think it's crazy. I mean, it's just like, it's as though the culture didn't matter.
Yeah, and the justification for why you're doing the work you are doing,
Yeah.
No,
It's as though it didn't mean anything to anybody, or like this effect, like, but it's also, it's worse than, it's more pernicious than that, because it's part of like a very specific gradual erosion of what culture is and how culture is valued.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was going to ask about how you find your locations, but you kind of discussed this already.
Mm.
So, but yeah, I mean, also you are from England originally, and then you moved to Portugal. I was interested in the role of nationality within your work because I feel that Night for Day is very much kind of straddling these two or multiple nationalities and multiple national histories. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I had to have lived in Portugal for a bit of a time before I made something that referred to it. And I was nervous about that because you're a little bit damned if you do and damned if you don't. Like the film that I made before, No Trace of Accelerator, you know, I could have made that anywhere, really. I used a Portuguese crew, but it was in English and it was English actors. And that elicited some, yeah, criticism. So
Interesting.
I thought like it was also kind of time to have a reflection on that. And so I thought the only way I could really do that is if I let people speak for themselves. That was also part of the decision to let Isabel speak for herself.
Mm,
But also if I had within it that idea of it being half English and half Portuguese, or like it coming from this position of not knowing. And
mm,
that position of not knowing was both this not knowing, you know, like the conceit of the technology not being able to see properly was also like the conceit of the foreigner not really being able to see properly. And this sort of transposed identity of like the expat coming to live in this country and sort of being like an amateur social anthropologist for a little bit. It's also this kind of, it was also like a reflection on, obviously like a reflection on that to a certain extent, but at the same time, I've never really been interested in this sort of self-exoticism that people do, that people often want you to do also when you're an artist. This sort of like, oh, you're British, so I'm going to talk about rave culture or folk culture or whatever. Like, I don't want to do this. It's very commercially, I think it's something people really want you to do.
mm,
And also, you know, like I came up through art school right after the YBAs had been the last big thing. And it was very apparent that partly their success was based on this idea that they were so willing to tell their autobiography as part of their work, and that translated so well into tabloid culture. So this whole thing of the fictionalization of national identity as well, because all nation states are like fictionalized as well. That idea of traditions are fictionalized, and the idea of community is fictionalized, and so Night for Day particularly was also like in response to that idea of like, you know, many people migrate and live abroad.
yeah.
And that doesn't mean that, yeah, and if you don't sort of, and if you're constantly harking back to some sort of original of the idea of like what's real in that, it kind of ignores what's right in front of you. It was also kind of a response to that.
Wow. Yeah. It's really, it's really interesting to also bring that in when thinking about the film, you know, this national ambiguity as well as uh, historical media, like all of these things. Yeah, really interesting.
No, because
Um,
it's a bit also where he talks about, you know, where I have this footage from Rise of the Planet of the Apes, where he's talking about like, I don't mind going back to the past, because she's like getting nostalgic about this idea of utopia. He says, I don't mind going back to the past, but I want it to be like my imaginary past, not your imaginary past. And
absolutely.
there's this feeling that he, it's also to do with this kind of like conjuring up of the idea of what's natural, you know, that was, or like the utilization of the idea of survival of the fittest by capitalism, also this kind of bastardization of Darwin's ideas. And I was also like kind of interested in alternative biological readings of that stuff, like Stephen Jay Gould, that he was always talking about how at every stage in evolution everything could have been different. It wasn't as though the masters of the universe came in and took what was rightfully theirs. That kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, God complexes. um, and so I was interested, yeah, in your voice as an author within Night for Day and how you kind of augment that or you make it visible through text or through the voice of Alan Rickman. But it's, yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. Um, maybe I can start by talking about Alan Rickman. So Alan Rickman, I was thinking a lot about how time was when you die, because we know he died. Like when you die, your voice disappears. Like I mean, of course, we've had recordings of voices for a really long time, but that idea of being able to put words into someone's mouth who's passed, this is like a really contemporary technology. And it's also, obviously, because of fake news, a really contentious technology. And I was particularly interested in him because he always seemed to me like an actor who, and his voice that I use in the film is his voice when he's young, when he was like playing romantic leads. And he played this romantic lead in a British movie by Minghella, where he's the ghost of a woman. A woman loses her lover, and he comes back and he sort of haunts her.
Wow.
And it's very it's before it's before he did Die Hard, and it's before he did Robin Hood, and like and before he got calcified as this sort of evil villain, because of, I don't know, because he didn't fit like the idea of what's conventionally good looking, or because of his voice. I don't know what it was, but his career got calcified. So he made a lot of money, you know, like from Harry Potter, he made like a ton of cash, but he also is a really great actor, was a really extraordinary actor. But so he also became to me sort of emblematic of this industrialization of the human body, and particularly with him, the human voice, because his voice is so distinctive. So to have him coming in as like the last, to have him being the voice that like the son, who might be the computer, who might be me, the voice that thing finds, is also was also important to me, like symbolically. And then on top of that, that idea of kind of like an artist finding their voice, you know, that one like talks about that in musicians finding their voice, or like painters finding their, or everybody tries to find their voice, is also like a lot of like I'm also really interested in that, like how do you find like your signature, or do you find and what happens when you do that? Do you become like a caricature of yourself? Or yeah. And Rickman, to me, Rickman's so confusing and complex, because he talks about all of that stuff somehow. That life talks about all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I suppose it's the kind of problem with visibility, is that once you reach a certain level, or you are seen in a certain light, you're pushed back into that box. And that box is something that gives you, like you said, value and finance, but then you're limited. So, and that's, you're no longer your own. Like that's the interesting, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
um, so I was also wondering about the role of AI and virtual technologies in the construction of Night for Day. So whether that was kind of a part of the process, or whether, yeah.
I would say there wasn't that much. I mean, I made the film for almost no money. And even the sort of conceit of, even the conceit of Rickman's voice, yeah, it's like a conceit of that technology. There isn't a lot of AI.
Okay, cool.
There's like pretending to be that. There's drones, and there's animation, a lot of kind of animation of, so all the stuff that's inside of dark, ruinous spaces that are actually near my studio in Linda Velia, that's, yeah, animated. That's all animated, and they're all like fake. I don't know if anyone ever sees this. No one's talked to me about it, but like they're all like fake Cindy Sherman untitled film stills, like being flashed into those spaces. I don't think anyone's seen this, but
Oh my
there's because no one's asked me about it. But there's like because Isabel's talking about these you know, these women that are performing gender, and I was trying to make also this parallel with Sherman's really famous untitled film stills, you know, like, and thinking about what happens if gender is thought of as a performative act, and what happens also when, if that's transposed to Portugal much earlier, with where the stakes are really high. But
Yeah. Wow.
it's not really AI, it's animation.
No, that's great. It's really interesting. I feel like also, yeah, I really want to revisit the work now and see the Cindy Sherman. um, but yeah, so I wanted to ask about um, your relationship with yeah, feminism, basically, in what you do, whether that's yeah part of your practice, your thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a film that I made in 2010 called Gamekeepers Without Game that I think has a really strong connection to Night for Day, and that was also, I would say, quite talking to an idea of patriarchy and destruction of patriarchy.
Mm.
And I think, yeah, it's important to talk about feminism because we still need shelters for battered women outside of every urban space, because women still get paid less than men for doing exactly the same jobs, because of the scrutiny and aggression that women in positions of power have, because of the devaluing of everything that's been seen as being naturally feminine. You know, like, I often still hear people referring to women who decide to be stay-at-home moms as though they're doing nothing, like I've heard, whereas sort of like, yeah, people who gamble with our money through the banking system make extraordinary amounts of money, everything, yeah, it all just seems very rigged.
Yeah.
Against women. So I think it is, and doesn't seem to be getting solved. So yeah, it is important, and it has been and will continue to be important to talk about, for
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. Yeah.
Also, like it was great to give Isabel a voice in this, and it was great to also, like, obviously it wasn't kind of by accident that it's an older woman and younger men, and it isn't an accident that it's two younger men and one
Mm-hmm.
older woman, obviously because of this constant normalization within mainstream media of the idea of like older men dating younger women, and like these poor actresses that have to act like that's attractive and all of these things, you know, and then we see sort of this playing out all the time in culture.
Yeah,
And it's also, it's in Portuguese society, it also feels very like it needs to be spoken about.
that's really interesting.
But in all societies, honestly, it needs to be spoken about.
It's like structures of power and gender, and yeah. So how did you meet Isabel de Carmo?
So my producer and good friend, Anjay Perzin, who runs Stena Projects, actually has done a lot of work with all the revolutionary brigades years ago. He has lots of interviews that his friends are constantly trying to get him to do something with. But I think he's a little bit reluctant to, for his own reasons. So he knew Isabel. And a few other people also. When I said I was looking for a woman to become the mother, she was a person that kept on coming up. And like initially, actually, I was thinking I would have the whole family. So I was meeting also Jose Veloso. Do you know this architect who was part of SAL? This sort of, there was an amazing project right after the revolution where they got very famous Portuguese architects to design social housing, to replace the barracas, the kind of shanty towns that were and still are around a lot of the cities in Portugal. And Jose Veloso is one of those architects. So I did a lot of interview with him, actually, and that was amazing. But then at some point I knew that I had to make the film much smaller. So I had to choose like whether it was a father and daughter or a mother son, and the mother son also kind of like came together because I already knew Alexander and Jalal too, and I knew their work, so everything kind of came together. And because Anjay already knew Isabel and she trusted him, that was a great way to be introduced and to be with her. And then that whole interview process, which was, I mean, I think she's very used to doing interviews because people ask her all the time, and she writes for the press, you know, like, and she's also a practicing doctor, and she's also an expert on eating disorders. Yeah,
Wow.
the mega woman. But she, I think at some point, I really prepared for those interviews. I did a lot of research, and she said like that they were the best. It was the most research anyone had ever done for an interview. I think it was also important to me that she might have just been flattering me. It was important to me too that she did, that I gave her the opportunity to talk about things like dialectical materialism, to talk about her philosophy and the philosophy of like not taking another human life, and how all of these things were very grounded in that idea of, and that part for me is the most touching part also of the film, where there's a kind of mashup between her explaining what dialectical materialism is, which is this constant dialogue with what's in front of you, and them and Jalal speaking about how it's when you're feeding images into a computer and trying to get it to see the world or see moving images. He says at some point, there are many more images that you can make a machine that are possible to see in the real world. And you really get this sense of like this complete chasm between a way of seeing that understands the importance of organic reality and its extraordinary richness, and another that thinks that it's just there to sort of be used up.
That's really interesting. I went to a 2-day lecture at Malmausch actually, Monday, Tuesday, and I found it really interesting, the generational divide, because I was going to ask you about kind of what you think about, you've already kind of answered it anyway, but yeah, that kind of the younger generation did not see that there was any division between the virtual and the physical. And this is something that was like a fact for them. And I suppose, you know, I'm somebody as a filmmaker who's always been critical of that. I'm trying to understand that. And it's really interesting to see your work because you're processing these questions, you're involving generational kind of perspectives. But yeah, I kind of wanted to, I suppose, expand on that, the material or the virtual, basically, as ideas, or as, yeah.
Yeah, because also I think now it's important to sort of because also if you read something like Glitch Feminism, I don't know if you've read this book by Legacy Russell, like this, if you read, there's also like a generation that not only doesn't want to make that divide, but also says that not making that divide is politically important for the disenfranchised. And that's, I think it's also like, I was also really aware to be careful not to be this kind of like curmudgeon towards technology. That wasn't also the point. And that's what I love also about Isabel talking about dialectical materialism, because it doesn't exclude technology. It doesn't exclude anything. What it says is that we're always in this process of re-knowing in accordance to that which we find in front of us. And that's like very important politically. It's very important in terms of technology. It's very important in terms of organic, like environmental issues. But it doesn't exclude any of those. And it doesn't also set up this kind of Shelley Turkle idea that we're never alone and we're never together. It's not like that divide either. It's a really important. And also for me, it was extremely important not to have this idea that politics was just something that happened in the past, you know, not to sort of like bring Isabel in as this, like, oh, wasn't it great in the good old days? Like also to bring her into dialogue with like what you see happening, what we see happening in terms of like this obsession with the idea of smart cities, or like this kind of, I often also think like that capitalism's obsession with growth is this kind of vagina envy, like this sort of psychological.
Reproductive, absolutely. Yeah, production, labor.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm not the first person to have thought that.
No, it's really interesting. No, I think that's exciting. I was super excited by that. Yeah. Yeah, super interesting. So I wanted to also ask about how long Night for Day took to create and what the editing process was like for that, basically.
Yeah, so it was about 2 years, and the edit was as though I sort of found it in the edit, because it started off with these different interviews, I guess 6 hours with Isabel and 6 hours with Zan and Jalal, and that was like the initial structure. And then it was me finding ways of making them speak to each other. And also this kind of things coming in threes came to me at some point, because I realized I also wanted it to be quite diaristic.
Mm.
And then the things coming in threes then beget the triangle, this composed piece of music. And it also started to make sense with Jalal talking about Bayesian frequency and this like way of being able to talk about the stars, because Bayesian frequency means that you don't need this large number of sample size in order to make conclusions. So this all seemed, it kind of found, I found it within them. And then certain things happen, like I knew that this Tales of Hoffmann opera was important because it's this very early example of a fembot, and because it's one of the hardest arias to sing in opera. It's like a woman pretending to be a robot that was pretending to be a woman. So for a soprano, she has to then do all of this, like, you know, out of human range singing, but also in this kind of counterintuitive, machinistic way. So that also was really beautiful. And then the whole idea that opera used to mean worker, that it has this kind of relation, that it comes from this, but it's then gone on to become, again, this sort of very rarefied cultural, it has this sort of very rarefied cultural significance. And yeah, so stuff sort of found its way together, but that was really enjoyable, actually, working and editing that way. And if I compare it like to the way that I edited Gamekeepers Without Game, for instance, which was really like I executed a script, and that was conceptually important, that you know, the script almost came out whole, and then I shot it with a shooting ratio of 5:1, and I shot it with all of these acted scenes. They were almost like theatre. It was completely different editing process. It was very easy to edit because it was already there. But Night for Day was much more like evolution, I guess.
That's interesting. Yeah, cool. And so how do you approach the gallery space, and at what point do you kind of consider how you will combine your sculptural and video practices within that space?
It depends a little bit. It was quite a massive privilege to work in Rialto 6, because they gave me a 3-week installation period, and there I got to think a lot about the light, and how, you know, like I only wanted to have daylight. I didn't want to have theatrical light or sort of like exhibition light. So there was always that question of whether that was going to be enough, because I also wanted to filter half of the door so that half of it looked like night and half of it looked like day. And in the end, that felt pretty exquisite, also because it didn't interfere with the film. And then the installation of that film, of Night for Day, was such that I wanted it in Secession. It was a commission for Secession in Vienna. So like in Secession, I knew that I wanted half the space carpeted, partly because of the sound, but also because I wanted to mirror this Smithson example of the boy running in the sandpit that's half black sand and half white sand. Because also that was very important for this whole idea of like digital time and entropic time, pre-industrial cyclical time. And that also I don't really like it when people carpet out exhibition spaces. It makes me feel like I'm in an old people's home. So I also wanted to mess with this thing of like it being unfinished, but it related to the Smithson thing, and that it would like look wrong or messy. And the white carpet was nice because the white carpet also got dirty over time. But in Rialto 6, the floor is pale, so the carpet had to be black. So there were those decisions. Like it's always a process of like, we do this and don't do this, and I would say, yeah. So you think I thought about a lot in advance. I had a lot of conversations with Armando about it, and also about Night for Day. He also was great to talk to about that, because we argued about it a lot, and he politically comes from a very different place. So it was sort of that was really fascinating. And also, obviously, the work is about that kind of thing of like wanting to be able to put two opposing views in the same piece of work, rather than having this work that kind of is a fait accompli. So that whole process was also really fascinating.
That's great. And using the space to kind of open that up even further.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And also I wanted to show older works in Lisbon because, yeah, that's kind of nice.
I wanted to ask about is it on 16mm, the 639 Dregs and Rack and Rack?
Yeah, that's on 16. Yeah, that's like that's the oldest work in there. That was 2008.
Ah, cool.
That was like
Sorry, go on.
It was like that was a different research process because I was really interested in stained glass.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd gone around a lot of British cathedrals and churches and found it's very wild, stained glass. It's I mean, they're cool cartoons, and then you sort of realize that it's interesting now because at the moment I'm reading The Dawn of Everything, this Graeber novel book, and in it he talks about this kind of the way that he's not talking about medieval history, he's talking about prehistory, but it's like the way that we interact with the past is almost as though we're always reading it through the present, of course, but we're also reading it as in a really boring way, like so we're not really having a conversation with the people that we're talking to in the past. We're like sort of we're either making them into saints or we're making them into savages, and both of those are kind of patronizing and annoying. And I was think now, because I'm reading it at the moment and I'm watching Six Serena and Dregs and Wreck and Wreck back again, I'm also thinking about like how these old stained glass windows are so wild and so hilarious, and but that they also had this very sort of, in a way, they had like an agenda to sort of speak to this public that was largely illiterate, because at the time when I made it, I mean, I made it to be jolty like the stained glass is. I made it to be kind of fragmented like it is, for it to be sort of lit like it is, and funny like it is, and sort of awkward like it is, and all of these things. But it was also a companion piece to this much more serious piece that I made called Sea Oak, which was composed from interviews with this left-leaning think tank in Rockridge called the Rockridge Institute in Berkeley in California. And they were looking a lot into the use of metaphor in political rhetoric. So they were looking a lot at like the way that Karl Rove wove religion into the Republican Party discourse as a way of also simultaneously talking to a lot of people. And so I was trying to also make these like historical parallels between what was happening pre-Obama election in 2008 and what was happening like way back in the Middle Ages, and you know, so it was kind of, it worked on different levels. It was interesting to see it again too.
No, absolutely. I really like the theatricality of it, and I think it's interesting how you use the stained glass as a way to also formally construct the film. You know, yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, like a sort of early, it's almost like felt also like an early digital, like this very jolting edits.
Yeah. Did you edit digitally, or did you edit like with a editing table?
No, I did it all digitally, and then I put it on film because because in the end I wanted to have the light shining through the film, like the light shines through the glass.
Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to say, is that's a really amazing kind of double meaning with the stained glass. It's also like an early cinema kind of tool. It's like a magic lantern. So
For sure. And the fact that it dies unless it's lit is also that it's sort of there as a potential that then the light comes in and animates it.
that's beautiful. So I have only a few more questions. And so first I wanted to ask about your artistic influences, which might be a bit broad, but are there any specific artists that you feel, or at least currently, are very kind of important to you, or you see yourself in lineage with?
Yeah, it's always a bit to do with individual works rather than, I don't really don't do that dive into someone's practice so much, but things that, the thing that really got me recently was this Tony Coates installation in the Berlin Biennale. He showed a bunch of work in a basement on monitors mainly. And one was this piece called Evil Selma 27, which was looking at how the switch from radio to television coincided with the civil rights movement. And he talks a lot about like what happens when you understand something purely through radio, and then you have to understand it in your own mind and form your own picture of it, and it becomes part of your own life, as opposed to when it comes to you as an image, and the image sort of comes to you as though it's whole, and that has a completely different relationship. And also the way that he installs is very hard and very musical. He uses music in this way also, like I mean, a lot of artists have done this, and I think it's kind of interesting to chart like the difference between someone like Peter Gadell, for instance, and his complete suspicion of illusory cinema, even like Fassbinder. And then someone like Pierre Huyghe, for instance, like, and then chart that to Pierre Huyghe's making, working with Dog Day Afternoon as like raw material, or Stan Douglas working with films as raw material, as though they were paint. I think Tony Coates does this thing where he works with music as though it's also like raw material, and it becomes, I don't know, it really does something very powerful, I think, in the work, the simplicity of it also, that because in that he's using Morrissey, he's using the Smiths, and of course, like that's so much a part of everybody's of my generation's kind of childhood. But then the lyrics in comparison to this text that's coming up on screen, and you're piecing it all together in your own mind, and it's incredible. Like that work is so incredible. So yeah, someone like him. Angela Melitopoulos's film Animism, I think about a lot. It repeats on me. Erica Beckman's Super 8 trilogy. Susana de Sousa Diaz, I think about her a lot. There's this film you probably know, O Fantasma, by Joao Pedro Rodriguez, which is also like as though he ate bataille and then defecated it out in the shape of an animal, and that's the film. It's just like, how how do you are really watching it, I'm just like, how does, talking about research, like how do you bodily do something that's so close to that philosophy without it feeling even mildly pedagogical or academic? This is yeah, there's a lot.
Wow.
Yeah, really incredible work.
Super cool. I'm excited to kind of check that out.
That is a masterpiece.
Yeah. And so my second to last question is, what was it like making a publication for the film for Night for Day?
Yeah, such a joy. Also because, you know, it's a publication with Secession, and then you're entering into that whole history of Christopher Williams and like, but also I was working with this graphic designer in called Klaus Jew in Copenhagen, who's brilliant, and who's so enthusiastic about stuff like the tiny lettering on the spine, and you know, he gets really excited about doing that instead of getting annoyed about doing that, because that's really difficult to do, and the binding on the spine. And I was trying to make it look like it had faded in the sun on one side and on the other side, but also it's like a way of, yeah, reflecting somehow the research process that went into the interviews, I guess, and stuff like even this thing of, it's amazing to be able to commission people like Kirsten and Marta Kuzma to write, and it's also really amazing to be able to think about, you know, putting stuff like Hannah Proctor's essay on historical materialism in there too, so that you kind of you get to sort of, yeah, create a sort of orbit for the film.
That's great. Really cool. And my last question is about how you feel about the moving image scene in Portugal, and kind of about your perspective on artist moving image today as a sort of area of art making, if
Uh,
that's relevant to you.
yeah, of course. I think Portugal has a very strong cinema scene. Um, and I think, yeah, you obviously have spaces like Oporto or Faro now, that does a lot for actually kind of putting artist moving image into space and letting it breathe and making it social and making it exist on its own terms. Extremely important. I feel like there's a lot of really exciting things going on, and there's a lot of really incredible artists working in moving image. Salome Lamas and Igor Jesus and Alexandra Estrella, João Maria Guzmão, all of these kind of there's a lot going on. I feel like there could always be more going on. And I feel like it's quite difficult to integrate if you're not Portuguese. And I hear a lot of people saying that, and I feel like maybe there just needs to be more kind of discussion platforms for people to share their work, like stuff. We do this thing, or we did this thing in Malmo called The Lab, where you just have 4 students and everybody would present their work and then give feedback on other people's work. And it kind of feels like, yeah, at some point, maybe it's worth setting something like that up.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is also my reasoning behind creating the institute, which is sort of an imaginary institute, but it'll be a physical one. But yes, this idea of like an experimental place where filmmakers or artists can come together and discuss that, and it's not necessarily rooted in the national in a way. It can be transnational. I think could be really exciting. But yeah.
Tell me more about it. What is it? Is it going to be at Pada?
So I'm currently looking for spaces in Beirut because it's more affordable than Lisbon. So it would be external to Pada. And yeah, I think, at least from my perspective, it feels very necessary, especially because being an outsider in some way, I suppose I'm not necessarily an outsider, but it feels that way, especially when you move somewhere new. It is necessary to be able to create a space where people from all backgrounds, all nationalities can kind of come and discuss moving image artwork that's not just a part of the kind of art world hierarchies, basically. And that there's room for mistake and room for error and room for things that aren't finished. I think that's really the motivation behind the Institute. But it's very early days, which is why I'm also very excited to have been able to see your work and to interview you, and to, yeah, include you in the kind of formation of this institute.
Oh, fantastic. It sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing and necessary.
Yeah, I hope it can grow, and I hope that more and more people can kind of participate in the formation of it, bring what they need, what they want. But thank you so much for all of your insights and your perspectives, and it's been really amazing to interview you. And
Yeah, it's been really nice to talk to you.